The air conditioner hummed softly in the busy clinic, its constant sound blending with the hushed murmur of conversations in the waiting room. Sarah adjusted the badge on her impeccably pressed uniform, her fingers sliding over the gold letters that identified her role, senior attendant. 6 years of dedication to this job had taught her to maintain a calm smile even on the busiest days, and this Monday morning would be no different. Or so she thought. The digital clock blinked 8:47 when the glass door slid open, bringing with it a gust of humid air from the street and 2 new patients. The older woman, with neatly styled gray hair and designer clothes, walked hesitantly, leaning on the arm of her daughter, a woman in her 40s carrying a folder of documents. Sarah stood up, her professional smile already in place. "Good morning, how can I assist you?" The daughter stepped forward, placing the documents on the counter. "We have an appointment scheduled for 9 o'clock. Eleanor Montgomery." As Sarah typed the name into the system, she noticed the older woman's gaze fixed on her. It wasn't an ordinary look, it was the kind of scrutiny Sarah knew all too well, the kind that made her skin prickle uncomfortably. Still, she carried on with her task as efficient as ever. "Yes, I found the appointment. Mrs. Montgomery is scheduled to see Dr. Martinez. I just need to confirm a few details and—" "Helen." The older woman's voice sliced through the air like a blade, directed at her daughter. "I don't feel comfortable. Not with her." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken, but her hands remained steady on the keyboard. Years of experience had taught her to keep her composure, even when her insides screamed. Helen, the daughter, flushed crimson. "Mother, please," she whispered, but Eleanor continued, her voice growing louder. "No, I don't want to be helped by her. There must be someone else. Someone more appropriate." The conversations in the waiting room came to an abrupt halt. Sarah could feel all eyes turning toward her desk, some shocked, others curious, and a few openly indignant. The air conditioner's monotonous hum now felt deafening against the tense silence that filled the room. "Mrs. Montgomery," Sarah began, her voice controlled and professional, "I am the senior attendant of this clinic. I can assure you that I am fully qualified to—" "I don't care about your qualifications." Eleanor slammed her hand on the counter, causing the papers to flutter. "I'm already nervous enough about this appointment. I don't need any more complications. I want to speak to your supervisor." Mark, the security guard, was already approaching discreetly, his years of experience alerting him to potentially volatile situations. Sarah stopped him with a subtle gesture. She knew this moment, it was the kind of situation that defined not just her day but potentially her entire professional life. "Mrs. Montgomery," Sarah kept her voice steady, dignified. "I am the supervising attendant on this shift. If you feel uncomfortable with my service, I can call the clinic manager. However, I must inform you that any form of discrimination is—" "Discrimination?" Eleanor let out a sharp, nervous laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. I just want someone who makes me feel more secure. You understand, don't you?" The waiting room now buzzed with murmurs of indignation. A young mother sitting with her child covered his ears, as if shielding him from the toxic words hanging in the air. An elderly man in a suit stood up, visibly disturbed. Helen looked as though she wanted to disappear. "Mother, for God's sake, stop this. You're embarrassing us." "Embarrassing?" Eleanor turned to her daughter, her voice trembling. "You should be supporting me. I'm your mother, I'm nervous, I'm not feeling well, and I have the right to choose who attends to me." Sarah stood tall, her back straight, her face a mask of professional calm that concealed the storm raging inside her. Every word felt like a dagger, every look of disdain an echo of countless other similar situations she had faced throughout her life. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. "Excuse me," a firm voice rang out behind Eleanor. It was Dr. Clara, one of the clinic's physicians, who had stepped out of her office upon hearing the commotion. "Is there a problem here?" Eleanor turned, visibly relieved to see a figure of authority who aligned with her preconceived notions. "Oh, finally." "Yes, I was just explaining that I don't feel comfortable with—" "Mrs. Montgomery," Clara interrupted, her voice sharp as ice. "I just witnessed a blatant display of racial prejudice against one of our most competent employees. That is unacceptable in this clinic. In fact, it's unacceptable anywhere." Eleanor's face paled, then flushed crimson. "How dare you? I've been a client of this clinic for years. I have rights." "Yes, ma'am, you do have rights," Clara replied. "And so does Sarah. Just as all our staff and patients have the right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, background, or any other characteristic." Helen, visibly mortified, tried to intervene. "Doctor, please, my mother isn't well. She's nervous about the appointment, she's not herself today. Don't defend me." Eleanor snapped at her daughter. "You've always been like this, always trying to please everyone, always with your modern ideas about equality." And it was at that moment that Helen did something no one expected. She knelt. Not just knelt, but knelt in front of Sarah, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for my mother's behavior, for her prejudice, for the pain she's causing. This isn't right. None of this is right." "Excuse me," a firm voice rang out behind Eleanor. It was Dr. Clara, one of the clinic's physicians, who had stepped out of her office upon hearing the commotion. "Is there a problem here?" Eleanor turned, visibly relieved to see a figure of authority who aligned with her preconceived notions. "Oh, finally. Yes, I was just explaining that I don't feel comfortable with—" "Mrs. Montgomery," Clara interrupted, her voice sharp as ice. "I just witnessed a blatant display of racial prejudice against one of our most competent employees. That is unacceptable in this clinic. In fact, it's unacceptable anywhere." Eleanor's face paled, then flushed crimson. "How dare you? I've been a client of this clinic for years. I have rights." "Yes, ma'am, you do have rights," Clara replied. "And so does Sarah. Just as all our staff and patients have the right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, background, or any other characteristic." Helen, visibly mortified, tried to intervene. "Doctor, please, my mother isn't well. She's nervous about the appointment, she's not herself today. Don't defend me." Eleanor snapped at her daughter. "You've always been like this, always trying to please everyone, always with your modern ideas about equality." And it was at that moment that Helen did something no one expected. She knelt. Not just knelt, but knelt in front of Sarah, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for my mother's behavior, for her prejudice, for the pain she's causing. This isn't right. None of this is right." The gesture, so dramatic and unexpected, froze everyone in place. Sarah felt her hands tremble for the first time that morning. "Please, Mrs. Helen, get up. You don't have to." "No," Eleanor shouted, grabbing her daughter's arm. "Get up now. How dare you humiliate yourself like this? The only one humiliating themselves here is you, Mrs. Eleanor," a deep voice echoed from the entrance. 2 police officers had arrived, discreetly called by Mark just minutes before. "We received a report about disturbance and racial discrimination. Would you please come with us?" What followed was a blur of activity. Eleanor, oscillating between indignation and fear, was escorted out of the clinic. Helen, still in tears, tried to follow but stopped at the door, turning back one last time to Sarah. "I'm truly sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "People like my mother, they need to change. We all need to do better." When silence finally returned to the clinic, it carried a different weight. Sarah remained at her post, acutely aware of the sympathetic glances, the murmurs of support, the shared expressions of indignation. Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of the professional mask she had worn for so long. "I am," she replied, her voice steady. "I need to be." But as she resumed her work, attending to the next patient with the same efficiency and warmth as always, Sarah knew that something had shifted that morning. Not just for her but for everyone who had witnessed the moment. Racism, so often silent and disguised, had shown its ugliest face, and the response, from the staff, the other patients, even the aggressor's daughter, showed that perhaps, just perhaps, the world was beginning to change. Even if it was just one small step at a time. Sarah came home that evening with the weight of the day still pressing on her shoulders. The small but cozy apartment, with its soft blue walls and carefully arranged family photos, had always been her sanctuary. But today, not even the familiar aroma of the dinner her daughter Melissa was cooking could ease the exhaustion that seeped into her bones. "Mom?" Melissa, her 17-year-old eyes filled with premature wisdom, immediately sensed something was wrong. She turned off the stove and approached, her braids swaying gently. "What happened?" Sarah let her bag slip to the floor and pulled her daughter into a hug, finally allowing herself to feel the vulnerability she had held back all day. The usual sweetheart. But today, it was different. As Sarah recounted the events of the morning, Melissa gently guided her to the sofa. The young girl listened intently, her eyes filling with a mixture of sadness and indignation. It was the same expression Sarah saw in the mirror every time she had to explain yet another scar left by prejudice. "You know what hurts the most?" Sarah ran her fingers through her curly hair, a gesture she always made when deep in thought. "Seeing that daughter's face, Helen. her desperation, her shame. It made me think of you, of how many times you've had to witness situations like this. Melissa squeezed her mother's hand firmly. But you've always taught me to be strong, to hold my head high. Yes, but at what cost? Sarah let out a weary sigh. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, if I should have reacted differently today. The phone rang, breaking the moment. It was Clara, the doctor from the clinic. Sarah? I'm sorry to call so late, but I needed to check on you. Clara's voice carried genuine concern. The board met this afternoon. They want to take stronger measures against situations like this. Sarah closed her eyes, recalling how many times she had heard similar promises before. Clara, I appreciate your concern, but... No, listen, Clara interrupted gently. This isn't just another empty promise. Helen, Mrs. Montgomery's daughter, came back to the clinic after her mother was released by the police. She wants to file a formal complaint against her own mother. The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah could feel Melissa's curious and concerned gaze on her. That won't change anything, Sarah finally replied. It won't erase what happened. No, it won't, Clara agreed. But it could be a start. Helen is determined to make something meaningful come out of this. She wants to use this incident to implement an awareness program at the clinic. And she wants your help. Sarah felt something stir in her chest, a mix of hope and skepticism that had become all too familiar over the years. Why would she care so much? Because, Clara paused meaningfully, she's a sociology professor. She specializes in structural racism studies. And according to her, spending years trying to educate others about prejudice while watching her own mother perpetuate these behaviors has been her greatest shame. Melissa, who was close enough to hear the conversation, gently squeezed her mother's arm. Mom, maybe this is an opportunity. Sarah thought about all the times she had swallowed her anger, kept her composure, and been professional in the face of prejudice. She thought about Helen's expression as she knelt, the quiet support from other patients, and Clara's genuine indignation. What exactly is she proposing? Sarah asked, her voice steadier now. A comprehensive training program for the entire staff. Regular workshops on diversity and inclusion. And she wants to start by sharing her own story, how growing up in a privileged family made her slow to recognize her own internalized biases. Sarah got up from the couch, walking over to the window. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual nighttime energy, thousands of stories unfolding simultaneously. How many of them were like hers? How many people swallowed their tears, anger, and humiliation every single day? You know, she began, turning to face Melissa, who watched her expectantly, your grandmother always said that real change happens when different people come together for a common cause. Melissa smiled, recognizing the words of her late grandmother, whose teachings still lived on in their memories. Clara, Sarah returned to the phone, tell Helen I'm willing to meet with her. But on one condition. I want this program to be more than just pretty words in a corporate manual. I want real action, real change. She'll be happy to hear that, Clara replied, and Sarah could hear the smile in her voice. In fact, she's here with me now. Would you like to speak with her? Sarah hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Melissa, about future generations, about everyone who faced the same kind of prejudice every day. Yes, she finally answered. I think we have a lot to discuss. As she waited for Helen to take the phone, Sarah glanced at the reflection of herself and Melissa in the window. Mother and daughter, two generations of strong women who had learned to turn pain into purpose. Perhaps this was what her mother always meant. That sometimes the biggest changes begin in the most unexpected moments, with the most unlikely people. Sarah? Helen's hesitant voice came through the line. I'm not quite sure where to start. Start from the beginning, Sarah replied, her voice gentle yet firm. Tell me why this is so important to you. And so, on this ordinary evening that had begun with so much bitterness, two women from completely different worlds started a conversation that promised to be the first step of a much larger journey. A journey of healing, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, real change. The small cafe on the corner of the clinic exuded a comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread as Sarah pushed open the glass door. The bell above rang softly, announcing her arrival. It was 2 p.m, the time carefully chosen to avoid the lunch rush. Melissa had insisted that her mother wear her favorite blue dress today, because some battles begin with small acts of courage, she had said while helping Sarah get ready. Helen was already there, sitting at a table near the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that seemed more like an emotional crutch than a drink. When their eyes met, the weight of the moment hung between them like an invisible curtain. You came, Helen said softly, standing up. There was gratitude in her voice, mixed with a nervous tension that made her hands tremble slightly. Sarah nodded and sat down. A young waitress quickly approached and Sarah ordered a café latte. The simple ritual of making the order gave her a few precious seconds to organize her thoughts. I brought something for you to see, Helen said after a moment, nervously rummaging through her bag. Her fingers found a worn photo album, its edges softened by time and frequent handling. I thought it would be important to share this, so you can understand. The album was placed on the table between them like an offering of peace. Sarah gazed at the faded cover, noticing old coffee stains and small repairs made with tape, signs of a cherished object, frequently consulted. The first pages revealed a story that Sarah hadn't expected to know. In black and white, a young Eleanor smiled radiantly, her eyes sparkling with a joy that seemed to belong to someone else. Beside her, a tall, dignified black man in a chauffeur's uniform returned the smile with equal warmth. This was Thomas, Helen explained, her voice heavy with emotion. He worked for my family for over 20 years. But he was much more than an employee, he was part of our family. At least that's how I saw him. Sarah studied the photographs carefully. There was something profoundly intimate about the images. Moments captured of shared laughter, small celebrations, scenes of everyday life that spoke of a genuine connection. In one particular photo, Thomas was holding a young Helen on his shoulders, both of them laughing at something out of frame. He taught me how to ride a bike, Helen continued, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the photograph. He used to tell me stories when I had nightmares. He knew exactly how I liked my hot chocolate. Extra marshmallows and a little bit of cinnamon. The waitress returned with Sarah's coffee, and the rich aroma filled the space between them. Helen waited for her to move away before continuing. Thomas died protecting me, protecting my mother, actually. It was just an ordinary night, we were coming back from a concert. 2 armed men tried to rob us. Her voice faltered slightly. Thomas, he stepped in front of my mother. He didn't hesitate for a second. Sarah felt her throat tighten. How old were you? 12, Helen replied, turning another page in the album. That was the last time I saw my mother smile for real. After that, she changed. The fear turned into bitterness and bitterness into prejudice, Sarah finished softly. Helen nodded, unshed tears glistening in her eyes. I found her diary after the incident at the clinic. The last pages, they're all about Thomas. About how she never forgave herself for him dying while protecting her. How it was easier to turn the pain into anger than to face the guilt. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, letting the silence stretch between them. At the next table, a child knocked over their juice, and the sudden noise made both of them jump. The child's mother, a young Asian woman, quickly began cleaning up the mess, murmuring embarrassed apologies. Let me help, Sarah and Helen said almost simultaneously, standing up. In the next few minutes, the 3 women worked together to clean up the spill, sharing understanding smiles and kind words with the child, who was now sniffling embarrassed. When they sat back down, something had changed between them. The air felt lighter, as if that small act of shared kindness had dissolved some of the tension. You know, Sarah began, opening her own bag, my daughter Melissa asked me last night why I was willing to do this. Why not just sue your mother and end it all? She pulled out a battered notebook, its pages marked with colorful post-its and notes in the margins. I started writing down some ideas after we spoke on the phone. About the program you want to implement? Helen leaned forward, intrigued. Can I see? The pages of the notebook revealed meticulous notes, ideas for workshops, sharing sessions, hands-on training. But more than that, they showed the dedication of someone who had turned decades of pain into purpose. I thought we could start with personal stories, Sarah explained. Not just mine or yours, but from all the staff who want to share. Create a safe space where people can be honest about their experiences and prejudices. Helen studied the notes intently. Clara told me that you keep a diary too. That you document every incident of prejudice you encounter. I started when Melissa was born, Sarah confirmed, a soft smile appearing on her lips. I wanted to have a record, something to show her that she wasn't alone when facing her own battles. That others had gone through the same and survived, even thrived. The distant sound of an ambulance siren filtered through the cafe windows, reminding them of the world beyond that shared moment. Sarah, Helen began hesitantly, do you think people can really change? Even after so much time? Sarah thought about her own journey, the countless times she had to choose between bitterness and hope. I believe people can change when they find strong enough reasons to do so. And sometimes those reasons come from the most unexpected places. She paused, carefully choosing her next words. Your mother lost someone she loved in a traumatic way. Instead of processing that loss, she let fear transform her into someone Thomas probably wouldn't recognize. But the fact that you're here trying to make a difference, that means something. Helen wiped away a tear that had escaped. I'm so scared of failing. Of not making enough of a difference. Real change starts with conversations like this, Sarah replied, gesturing to the space between them. With people willing to be honest, to listen to each other, to face hard truths. By the time they finally said goodbye, hours had passed. The afternoon sun cast golden shadows through the cafe windows, and their plans for the training program had taken shape across several pages of notes. Sarah, Helen called once they were on the sidewalk. Do you think one day you could meet my mom again? Not now, but when she's ready, if she's ready? Sarah adjusted the strap of her bag, feeling the weight of the notebook inside it. When she's truly ready for an honest conversation, yes. Because sometimes, Helen, the greatest act of resistance against prejudice is showing our humanity to those who try to deny it. As they walked in opposite directions, each carrying the weight and hope of that conversation, the sun began to set over the city. It was the end of a day, but the beginning of something much bigger. A journey of healing that started with two women brave enough to believe in the possibility of change. Melissa watched her mother attentively as Sarah organized the papers on the kitchen table. It was Saturday night, and the aroma of dinner still lingered in the air. The 2 cups of tea between them emitted a gentle steam, creating a warm atmosphere in the shared moment. So, she really showed all those old photos? Melissa asked, leaning in to examine her mother's notes. Must have been intense. Sarah paused, her fingers resting on a particularly detailed page in her notebook. It was eye-opening. You know, sometimes we forget that behind every person who hurts us, there's a whole story. Not that it justifies. It doesn't justify, Melissa gently completed, but it helps understand. Sarah's phone vibrated on the table, a message from Helen. She found some more old documents, Sarah explained, reading the message. Letters Thomas wrote to her family over the years. The driver? Melissa asked, her curiosity evident. Much more than that, Sarah replied, a sad smile on her lips. He was family to them until... Her voice trailed off, remembering the story Helen had shared. The doorbell rang, surprising mother and daughter. Through the peephole, Sarah recognized Clara, the doctor from the clinic, carrying a thick folder. Sorry for showing up unannounced, Clara said as soon as the door opened. But I thought you needed to see this immediately. She entered, greeting Melissa with a quick hug. The two had met during several of Melissa's visits to the clinic over the years. Clara placed the folder on the table between the teacups. Helen sent me this early today. It's old records from the clinic, from when Thomas was a patient there. Sarah felt her heart race. Thomas was a patient at our clinic? For almost 15 years, Clara confirmed, opening the folder. And look who was the doctor responsible for him. The name on the medical record made Sarah hold her breath. Dr. James Montgomery, Eleanor's late husband. Helen's father treated Thomas all that time, Clara explained. From the records, they developed a close friendship. There are personal notes here that go way beyond the doctor-patient relationship. Melissa, who had leaned in to get a closer look, noticed something. Mom, look at this. She pointed to a photo stapled to one of the documents. An old image showing Thomas, Dr. Montgomery, and Eleanor at a picnic. On the back, a date and a message. Family isn't just blood. Sarah sat down, feeling the weight of that revelation. How does someone go from considering a person family to... She couldn't complete the sentence. Trauma does strange things to people, Clara said gently. Helen told me that she found Eleanor crying last night, looking at these same photos. Sarah picked up her phone, rereading Helen's message. There was more. My mom asked about you today. For the first time without anger in her voice. The silence that followed was broken by Melissa. Mom, do you remember that story Grandma always told? About how she forgave the man who... The one who hit your uncle, Sarah completed. Yes, I remember. She always said forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for herself. Clara flipped through more papers in the folder. There's something else here that you need to see. She pulled out a yellowed envelope, still sealed, addressed to Eleanor in Thomas's handwriting. A letter he never delivered, Clara explained. Helen found it among her father's belongings after his death. She wants you to read it first, Sarah. With slightly trembling hands, Sarah opened the envelope. The letter was dated a week before Thomas's death. Dear Eleanor, as I write this letter, James has just given me the results of my latest tests. The news isn't good, but you know me, I've always been realistic about these things. 6 months, he said. Maybe less. I wanted you to know something I never had the courage to say in person. In the 20 years I spent with your family, I learned that true love knows no boundaries. You, James, and Helen gave me something I never thought I'd have, a place to belong. I know you carry deep fears, Eleanor. Fears that were there long before I met you, fears that sometimes make you build walls instead of bridges. But I also know the immense love that resides in your heart. Promise me something, don't let fear conquer love. Don't let the shadows of the past darken your future. And most importantly, teach Helen that the world can be a better place, but only if we have the courage to do our part to make it so. With eternal love, Thomas. When Sarah finished reading, she realized she wasn't the only one with tears in her eyes. Melissa had come up behind her, hugging her tightly, while Clara discreetly wiped her face. He never got the chance to deliver the letter, Sarah murmured. And a week later? He died protecting the one person he most wanted to protect from fear, Clara gently completed. Sarah picked up her phone again, this time to write a message to Helen. I just read the letter. Your mother needs to see it. It's not too late to rebuild bridges. The reply came almost immediately. Would you help me with this? There's so much we need to heal. Melissa, who was reading over her mother's shoulder, gently squeezed her arm. Sometimes people need help finding their way back to who they really are. Sarah looked at her daughter, feeling an immense pride in the wise young woman she had become. You know what? I think it's time to share some stories from our own family too. She stood up and walked over to a high shelf where she kept an old photo album. Your grandmother had to learn to forgive as well, to build bridges instead of walls. And maybe, she hesitated, glancing at Clara and then at Melissa, maybe it's time for all of us to learn that healing is a collective process. That night, as they shared more tea and old stories, something new began to take shape. It wasn't just about a training program at the clinic anymore, it was about reconnecting broken hearts, understanding that sometimes the deepest wounds need more than time to heal. They need the courage to face the truth, the compassion to understand each other's pain, and above all, the willingness to believe that it's never too late to start again. Eleanor Montgomery's house remained quiet that Sunday morning, the silence broken only by the soft ticking of the old clock in the living room. Helen watched her mother through the kitchen door, noticing how she seemed smaller, more fragile, sitting in her favorite armchair with Thomas's letter in her trembling hands. Are you sure you want to do this today? Helen asked softly, approaching with a cup of tea. The scent of chamomile filled the space between them. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on Thomas's words, reading them for the 10th time since Helen had handed them to her the night before. A solitary tear slid down her wrinkled cheek. 20 years, she finally murmured. 20 years and he knew. He knew my fears, my flaws, and still he loved us, Helen finished, sitting on the arm of the armchair. All of us. The sound of the doorbell cut through the moment. Helen felt her mother stiffen. Is it them? Yes, Helen confirmed. Sarah brought Melissa. I thought it was important for you to meet the 2 generations your words have affected. Eleanor carefully folded the letter, her movements deliberate as if she were buying time. I don't know if I can do this, Helen. You can, Helen held her mother's hand. Thomas believed in your strength. And I believe in it too. When Helen opened the door, Sarah and Melissa stood side by side, their serene expressions masking the tension of the moment. Sarah carried an old box under her arm. We brought something, Sarah said softly after they entered. Something we think you need to see. The Montgomery living room was a silent testament to a privileged life. Antique furniture, photographs in golden frames, memories carefully selected and preserved. But today, the lavish setting seemed only to heighten the vulnerability of the moment. Eleanor stood as they entered, her small body tense like a violin string. She began, but the words seemed to escape her. It's okay, Sarah said, her voice gentle. We're not here to accuse. We're here to share stories. Melissa, who had been silently observing until then, stepped forward. Mrs. Montgomery, did you ever know my grandmother Rose? The unexpected question made Eleanor blink, confused. No, I never had that privilege. She worked as a domestic servant for a family for 30 years, Melissa continued, helping her mother open the box they had brought. A white family like yours. And just like Thomas, she became more than just an employee. Sarah took from the box a worn photograph album, different yet strangely similar to the one Helen had shown her days before. My mother kept every moment, every memory, because she knew one day I would need to understand where I came from and where I could go. The women sat down, forming an intimate circle. Eleanor still held Thomas's letter, like a talisman. Rose faced a lot of prejudice, Sarah continued, opening the album. But she always said that hatred is like a chain. It binds both the one who hates and the one who is hated. The only way to break free is through love. Thomas used to say something like that, Eleanor whispered, her voice choked. He always found a way to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Just like he saw the best in you, Helen gently added. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears now freely streaming down her face. I loved him like a brother. When he left, something inside me broke. It was easier to blame, to hate, to build walls. Easier than admitting that fear had turned me into someone he wouldn't recognize. Sarah extended her hand, lightly touching Eleanor's arm. The gesture, simple but profound, made the entire room hold its breath. Do you know why I came today? Sarah asked. It wasn't for revenge or justice. I came because I understand what it's like to lose someone we love and to allow that loss to transform us. My mother taught me that true strength is choosing love, even when fear seems easier. Melissa opened her purse, pulling out something that surprised them all, an old yellowed photograph. I found this among Grandma Rose's belongings. Look. The photograph showed a young Rose smiling next to an elderly white woman, both holding a baby. On the back, an inscription, family is not color, it's love. It's the same phrase, Helen whispered, looking at her mother. The same one Thomas wrote on our photos. Eleanor took the photograph with trembling hands, her eyes moving between the image and Sarah's face. How much time I wasted, she murmured. How much love I denied, how much fear I nurtured. It's never too late to start over, Sarah said firmly. Thomas knew that. Rose knew that. And we here know that. That's why we created the program at the clinic, Helen added. It's not just about training or awareness. It's about creating spaces where people can be honest about their fears, their losses, their hopes. Eleanor suddenly stood up, walking to an old shelf. Carefully, she took out a carved wooden box. James, my husband, kept this. These are all the letters Thomas wrote to him over the years. Medical letters at first, but then they were letters from one friend to another. She opened the box, revealing dozens of envelopes organized chronologically. Perhaps, she hesitated, looking at Sarah, perhaps these stories need to be shared as well. To show that true love transcends all the barriers we create. Melissa, who had remained quiet, observing, finally spoke. Grandma Rose always said that stories are bridges between hearts. The more stories we share, the more bridges we build. The 5 women spent the next few hours sharing memories, tears, and surprisingly, laughter. Eleanor talked about Christmas dinners with Thomas, how he always saved the last piece of pecan pie for Helen. Sarah shared stories of Rose, her quiet wisdom and unwavering strength. As the sun began to set, casting golden shadows through the living room windows, something had changed. The weight of the silence that had suffocated the house for so long started to lift, replaced by something lighter, more hopeful. Sarah, Eleanor called as they were getting ready to leave. That day at the clinic, I can't undo what I did, but I promise to do better, to be better. For Thomas. For all of us. Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. That's all he would want to hear. As they walked to the car, Melissa grabbed her mother's arm. Do you know what else Grandma Rose used to say? That sometimes we need to completely lose ourselves to truly find who we are. Sarah looked back at the house, where Eleanor and Helen were still at the door, their silhouettes framed against the evening light. And sometimes, she replied, we need to help others find themselves to discover our own way. A week after the meeting at the Montgomery house, the clinic felt different. It wasn't physical changes, the same white walls, the same flow of people, the same gentle hum of the air conditioning. The difference was in the air, in the way people looked at each other, greeted one another, shared smiles. Sarah was organizing her desk for the first workshop of the awareness program. The meeting room had been transformed. Chairs arranged in a circle, a table with coffee and cookies, fresh flowers in a simple vase. Little details that made the environment more welcoming. Nervous? Helen asked, entering the room with more files. Her smile was kind, understanding. A little, Sarah admitted, adjusting one last chair. I never thought I'd be here doing this. None of us did, a familiar voice said from the door. It was Eleanor, arriving early for the workshop, her hands holding a photo album that Sarah recognized. Eleanor's presence still caused a slight discomfort for Sarah, a residual tension that both of them were learning to navigate. But today there was something different in the older woman's gaze, an intensity mixed with vulnerability. I brought something to share, Eleanor said, stepping closer. Photos I've never shown anyone. Not even Helen. The three women sat down and Eleanor carefully opened the album. The first photo showed a much younger Eleanor, perhaps in her 20s, standing next to an elderly black woman. This was Martha, Eleanor explained, her voice soft with memories. She worked for my family when I was a child. She taught me that love has no color. She paused, letting the words settle. And it was because of her that I met Thomas? Helen leaned in, surprised. You never told me this. Because I was ashamed, Eleanor admitted. Not of Martha, not of Thomas, but of how I let fear erase those precious memories. Martha was the one who recommended Thomas to work with our family. She saw in him the same goodness that had shaped my childhood. Sarah looked at the photos, noticing how Eleanor's smile in the old pictures carried the same light she saw in Melissa's eyes. A pure joy, still untainted by fear or prejudice. Why are you sharing this now? Sarah asked softly. Because I understood something, Eleanor replied, turning to another page in the album. When Thomas died, I didn't just lose a friend. I lost the person I was when I was with him. The person Martha had helped me become. The sound of more people arriving for the workshop filled the hallway. Clara entered, followed by other clinic staff. Among them was Melissa, who had insisted on attending. Mom, Helen gently touched Eleanor's arm. Are you sure you want to do this? Share these stories with everyone? Eleanor straightened her shoulders, a gesture that reminded her of her old, proud posture, but now it carried a different purpose. Thomas always said that stories are like seeds, they need to be planted to grow. I've kept these hidden for too long. As the room filled up, Sarah noticed something extraordinary happening. People who usually barely acknowledged each other in the hallways were talking, sharing nervous smiles, creating small connections. Welcome, Sarah began, her voice firm and warm. We're here today not just for training but to begin a journey together. Eleanor stood up, surprising everyone. If you'll allow me, I'd like to start by sharing a story. A story about love, loss, and the price we pay when we let fear define us. The silence that followed was different from the tense silence of that first day at the reception. It was a silence of expectation, of openness. Eleanor began to tell the story of Martha, of Thomas, of how love can create families that transcend blood and color. Her voice, initially hesitant, grew stronger with each word. Melissa, sitting next to her mother, held Sarah's hand. Over the past few weeks, their relationship had deepened in ways neither of them had expected. Seeing her mother not only survive prejudice but transform it into something positive had changed the way Melissa saw the world. After Thomas died, Eleanor continued, I built walls so high that I forgot what it was like to see the sky. I had to lose something precious. She looked directly at Sarah, to remember who I really am. Clara, who had been taking notes, paused to wipe away a discreet tear. Others in the room were also showing signs of emotion. A tissue here, a knowing glance there. But this is not a story about loss, Eleanor stated. It's a story about starting over. About how it's never too late to choose love over fear. Helen watched her mother with a new look of admiration. The transformation that had begun with a moment of shame in the clinic's reception was blossoming into something deeper, more meaningful. What happened here, Sarah spoke up, standing beside Eleanor, showed us that real change begins with honesty. With the courage to face our own shadows. Melissa raised her hand, surprising everyone. Can I share something too? Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. Her daughter had never spoken publicly about her experiences with racism. I grew up hearing stories from my grandma Rose, Melissa began, her voice young but steady. Stories of pain, yes, but mostly stories of hope. She always said that the heart has a power that hate will never have. The power to grow, to expand, to love more each day. Eleanor sat down again, her hands trembling slightly as she held the photo album. Helen noticed and covered her mother's hands with hers. What we're doing here today, Melissa continued, is exactly what Grandma Rose and Thomas tried to teach us. That family, love, and respect know no barriers. That we can choose to be bridges instead of walls. The morning went on with more stories being shared. A nurse spoke about his experience as an immigrant. A receptionist talked about raising her children to be different from her. More open, more aware. When the workshop ended, something had changed permanently. Not just in the clinic but in every person present. Eleanor approached Sarah, offering the photo album. I'd like you to keep this for a while, she said. Maybe Melissa would like to learn more about Martha, about Thomas. About how true love can heal generations of pain. Sarah accepted the album, feeling its weight, not just physical but emotional. Thank you, she said simply, but her words carried a world of meaning. As people left the room, Clara approached the small group that remained, Sarah, Melissa, Helen, and Eleanor. "This was just the beginning," she said, smiling. "But what an incredible beginning." Eleanor looked around at the now empty room, at the chairs arranged in a circle that had witnessed so many truths being shared. "Thomas would be proud," she whispered. "Martha too." "They are," Helen said firmly. "Through every story we share, every bridge we build, they live in us." Sarah watched her daughter animatedly talking to Helen about the upcoming workshops, about ideas to expand the program. The future, which had once seemed so heavy with the burden of prejudice, now shone with possibilities. Transformation, she realized, wasn't just about changing herself. It was about creating spaces where others could also change, grow, and flourish. It was about planting seeds of hope in the fertile soil of open hearts. 6 months had passed since that first workshop at the clinic. The fall painted the trees in golden hues, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of change through the air. Sarah sat on her favorite bench in the clinic garden, watching the patients arrive for their appointments. The place had transformed. It wasn't just the new policies or the colorful posters on the walls celebrating diversity. It was something deeper, more meaningful, a change in the hearts of the people. "Thinking about today's ceremony?" Melissa asked, sitting down next to her mother. She was holding 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Sarah. "It feels like it was just yesterday that everything started," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee. "Sometimes I still wonder if it's real." The ceremony they were referring to was the official opening of the Thomas and Rose Community Center, a space dedicated to awareness and support programs, built on the land adjacent to the clinic. The idea had been born during one of the workshops when Eleanor, in a moment of clarity, decided to do something truly meaningful with her legacy. "Helen just arrived with Eleanor," Melissa commented, pointing to the parking lot. "She looks different today." Sarah watched the 2 women get out of the car. Eleanor, who had once always moved with a defensive rigidity, now walked with a serene dignity. Her hands, which once trembled when holding the old photographs, now firmly carried a decorated box. "Good morning," Eleanor greeted, approaching. Her smile, once rare, now came naturally. "I brought something special for today." Helen helped her mother sit on the bench beside Sarah. "Mom spent all night organizing this." Eleanor carefully opened the box, revealing a new album, its pages still crisp from being so new. "This is for the center," she explained. "A history in photographs, not just of Thomas and Martha but of all of us. Of how we got here." The first pages showed old photos. Martha with young Eleanor, Thomas with the Montgomery family, Rose with her employer's family. But as the pages turned, new stories emerged. Photos from the workshops, smiles shared, moments of understanding and healing. "Look at this one," Melissa pointed to a particularly touching photo. It showed Eleanor and Sarah sitting together during one of the workshops, both laughing at something someone had said. The initial tension between them had dissolved into something surprisingly close to friendship. "That was the day I realized I was truly changing," Eleanor admitted softly. "It was no longer about trying to be different. It was about rediscovering who I've always been." Clara approached the group, carrying a stack of programs for the ceremony. "Everyone's arriving. You need to see this. There are people from the entire community here." Sarah stood up, adjusting her favorite blue blazer, the same one she'd worn on that first confrontational day. "I never imagined that moment of pain could bring us here. Sometimes we need to break completely in order to rebuild ourselves stronger," Helen reflected, her words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The new center was a modern yet welcoming structure, with large windows that let in abundant natural light. In the entrance hall, an entire wall had been dedicated to photos and stories, a living testament to how love could transcend generations of prejudice. As people began gathering for the ceremony, Sarah noticed something extraordinary. The crowd was diverse: clinic staff, patients, community members, whole families, all united by a common purpose. "Sarah," Eleanor called softly, holding her arm. "Before we start, I need you to see one last thing." She guided Sarah to a quieter corner of the lobby, where a bronze plaque shone on the wall. On it, a simple yet powerful inscription: "In memory of Thomas Williams and Rose Johnson, who taught us that true love knows no barriers, and in honor of all those who have the courage to choose love over fear." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Eleanor?" "It was Melissa's idea," Eleanor explained, smiling at the young woman who had become almost like a granddaughter to her. "She said we needed to honor not only the past but the future we're building." The sound of people settling into their seats caught her attention. It was time to begin. Sarah stepped onto the small stage, looking out at the expectant faces in the crowd. She saw Melissa, proud and strong. Helen, her eyes shining with held-back tears. Eleanor, transformed by the journey they'd shared. Clara, who had been an ally from the very beginning. And dozens of others, each carrying their own stories of pain and hope. 6 months ago, Sarah began, her voice firm and clear, something happened in this clinic that could have driven us further apart. Instead, it brought us together in ways we never imagined possible. She paused, letting her words settle. This center is not just a building. It is a symbol that we always have a choice. We can choose to remain trapped in our fears and prejudices, or we can choose to grow, to learn, to love. Eleanor stood up, joining Sarah on stage, a gesture no one would have predicted months ago. Thomas taught me that family is not defined by blood or color, Eleanor shared, her voice choked but determined. It is defined by love, by daily choices to look beyond our differences. Melissa was the next to join them, followed by Helen. 4 women, for generations of experiences, united in a moment of transformation. This center, Melissa spoke, is dedicated to everyone who has the courage to change, to question, to grow. It is dedicated to you, Helen added, looking directly at the audience. To all of you who chose to be part of this journey. When the ribbon was officially cut, inaugurating the Thomas and Rose Community Center, the applause that followed carried more than approval, it carried hope. Hope that small moments of courage could create waves of change. Hope that true, unconditional love could heal old wounds and create new paths. Sarah watched Melissa embrace Eleanor, Helen taking photos, Clara organizing the next steps of the celebration. Her heart overflowed with a simple yet profound certainty. Sometimes, from the most painful situations, the most beautiful transformations are born. That afternoon, as the sun set over the new center, painting the sky with shades of hope, Sarah thought of her mother Rose, of Thomas, of Martha, of all those who had planted seeds of love in soil not yet ready to bloom. Their seeds had finally found spring. The weight of silence had transformed into music of change, into stories of healing, into promises of a future where love truly transcends all barriers. And so, in a clinic that had once been a stage for discrimination, a space of transformation was born, not just of policies or procedures but of hearts and minds. A living reminder that it is never too late to choose love, to build bridges, to be the change we wish to see in the world. Every story of transformation begins with a single voice brave enough to break the silence. If Sarah, Eleanor, and their family's journey touched your heart, share in the comments a moment when love overcame fear in your own life. Your experiences are unique and valuable, they could be just the light someone needs to find courage on their own path. Join our family on the Life Stories channel, where we believe every story has the power to change lives. With a simple like and subscription, you become part of a community that celebrates the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to begin again, and the transformative power of true love. Remember, just as Thomas and Rose planted seeds of hope that blossomed years later, your words today can create waves of change for future generations. We'll see you in the next story, where once again we'll discover together that the strongest bonds are those the heart chooses to create.